On a December evening in 1904, a 65-year-old bank president named Charles Beckwith sat in his parlor in Oberlin, Ohio, and learned that everything he had was gone. His bank, his savings, his reputation built over 4 decades. Tears rolled down his furrowed cheeks. "God, then all is lost," he whispered. "All is lost, lost." He would be dead within months. The woman who destroyed him was at that moment lying in a New York hotel bed wearing a money belt stuffed with $100,000 in cash. She was born in a farmhouse. She had no inheritance, no fortune, no father worth naming. But she had told the bankers of America that Andrew Carnegie was her father, and not one of them had bothered to ask him. Chapter 1. The Farm Girl Who Declared War on Canada. At 13 years old, Elizabeth Bigley forged a letter from a lawyer who did not exist, announcing an inheritance she would never receive. The letter was addressed to her. It bore the seal of no firm and the signature of no man anyone in Eastwood, Ontario, could verify. But it looked real. It looked official. And for a girl born on a dirt farm in the flat, punishing countryside west of London, Ontario, it was a declaration. Not of wealth, of intent. Elizabeth was the 6th of 7 children born to Daniel and Mary Ann Bigley. The family worked a patch of land near the village of Eastwood, in Oxford County. The soil was decent. The house was not. Daniel Bigley was a blacksmith and occasional farmer whose name appears in no records of distinction. Mary Ann bore children, buried some, and endured. The Bigleys were the kind of family the Gilded Age was built on top of. They were the foundation no one looked at. Elizabeth arrived in 1857. She was partially deaf, and she spoke with a lisp that other children mocked. The adults around her made a quiet, devastating assumption. They mistook her difficulty hearing for difficulty thinking. Teachers underestimated her. Neighbors pitied her. Her own family seems to have regarded her as the slow one, the odd child, the girl who stared too long and said too little. They were wrong. What Elizabeth Bigley lacked in hearing she compensated for with observation. She watched. She studied the way people responded to confidence. She noted how a well-dressed stranger was treated differently from a poorly dressed neighbor. She understood, before she had the vocabulary for it, that identity in the 19th century was a performance, and that the audience rarely checked behind the curtain. The forged letter was her first act. She was 13. She had written to herself from a lawyer confirming that she had inherited a large sum of money. She showed the letter around Eastwood. She used it to open lines of credit at local shops. She bought things, not extravagant things, things a girl with a modest inheritance might buy. Fabrics, supplies, small luxuries. It did not last. The merchants checked. The lawyer did not exist. Elizabeth was exposed. But she had learned something. The punishment was mild. The merchants were embarrassed that they had been fooled by a child, and embarrassment, she discovered, is a form of silence. People who feel foolish do not advertise it. She tucked that lesson away. By the time she was 18, Elizabeth had graduated to a bolder play. She had calling cards printed that read Miss Bigley, Heiress. She traveled to nearby towns and presented herself as a woman of means. She ran up debts. She was eventually arrested and charged with fraud. The courtroom scene that followed was the first true performance of her career. Elizabeth Bigley stood before the judge and unraveled. She wept. She trembled. She spoke incoherently. She displayed every symptom of a woman in the grip of a mental breakdown. The judge, faced with a young woman who appeared to be genuinely insane, chose mercy. The charges were reduced. She was released. Her sister later recalled a conversation in the days that followed. Elizabeth, calm and dry-eyed, had whispered to her, "It's not that I'm crazy. It was just a way for the judge to let me go." She was 18 years old. She had already learned to forge documents. manufacture identities, exploit the reluctance of victims to speak, and perform madness convincingly enough to deceive a court of law. She had no money, no connections, and no formal education beyond what the rural schools of Ontario could offer. She had something better. She had a theory of how the world worked. And she was right. The girl from the Bigley farm was done with Eastwood. She was done with Ontario. She was done with Elizabeth Bigley. But she was not done with the performance. She was, in fact, just beginning to understand how large the stage could be. Hashtag Chapter 2. 8 names ANDA prison sentence. Between 1880 and 1897, the woman who would become Cassie Chadwick married, swindled, and reinvented herself so many times that even investigators lost count. The names pile up like discarded costumes. Madame LaRose, Madame Lydia DeVere, Lydia Springsteen, Marie LaRose, Cassie Hoover. Each identity was a new city, a new story, a new circle of men who never thought to check her past. She moved through the small towns and mid-sized cities of the American Midwest like smoke through a keyhole. By the time anyone realized she had been there, she was already someone else. The pattern was consistent. She would arrive in a town, well-dressed, and carrying an air of refinement that seemed just slightly too deliberate. She would find a man, usually a professional, usually lonely, always respectable. She would attach herself to him, borrow his credibility the way a vine borrows a wall, and then she would begin. The con was always financial. Forged checks, fraudulent promissory notes, small loans taken out under false pretenses. She was not yet working at the scale she would later achieve. These were rehearsals. $500 here, $1,000 there, enough to live well, enough to move on. In Cleveland, calling herself Lydia DeVere, she set herself up as a clairvoyant. She held seances. She told wealthy women that spirits had messages for them, and the messages always seemed to require a financial transaction. The women paid. The spirits were generous with their advice and relentless in their fees. Then she married a man named Dr. Wallace Springsteen. The marriage lasted 7 days. The details are murky. What is clear is that she took what she could from the arrangement and left. Dr. Springsteen disappears from her story as quickly as he entered it. He was not the first man she discarded, and he would not be the last. It was in Toledo, Ohio, that the curtain finally came down. Operating under one of her many names, she was caught forging a promissory note. The evidence was clear, the victim was vocal, and this time, no performance of madness would save her. She was convicted of forgery and sentenced to 9.5 years in the Ohio State Penitentiary. It was 1893. She was 36 years old. Her career, by any reasonable measure, should have been over. But prison did not break Elizabeth Bigley. It educated her. She spent her years behind bars studying the one subject that had always fascinated her most. People. She observed who had power and who did not. She noted which inmates received favor and which were forgotten. She refined her understanding of the gap between who a person was and who a person appeared to be. And then something extraordinary happened. Governor William McKinley, the same man who would later become the 25th President of the United States, signed her pardon. The reasons are unclear. There is no evidence that McKinley knew the full scope of her crimes or cared particularly about her case. Pardons in the 1890s were political currency, handed out for a variety of reasons, many of them mundane. But the effect was spectacular. Elizabeth Bigley walked out of the Ohio State Penitentiary a free woman. She also walked out a mother. Sometime during her years of wandering and deception, she had given birth to a son named Emile. The boy's father is unknown. Emile was raised under false names, kept at the margins of his mother's many lives, a child who existed in the gaps between her identities. He would grow up knowing almost nothing true about the woman who bore him. Free and pardoned, the woman who had been Elizabeth Bigley, Madame LaRose, Lydia DeVere, Lydia Springsteen, Marie LaRose, and Cassie Hoover, now faced a choice. She could disappear into anonymity. She could find honest work and live a quiet life. The pardon gave her that option. She chose otherwise. She chose Cleveland. And she chose the biggest lie of all. The question is not why she kept going. The question is what she had learned in prison that made her believe she could go bigger. The answer, almost certainly, is that she had discovered the one truth that would make her rich and destroy every man who trusted her. In the Gilded Age, nobody verified anything. They simply could not afford to appear as though they needed to. Hashtag Chapter 3, The Doctor Who Married a Ghost. Dr. Leroy Chadwick was a sociable man whose most consequential daily decision involved choosing between eggs and fruit for breakfast. And then he met a woman in a brothel. The word brothel is perhaps unkind to the establishment in question. It was, according to the more charitable descriptions of the era, a boarding house. It sat in a respectable enough part of Cleveland and catered to women of uncertain but not openly scandalous reputation. Cassie Hoover, as she was then calling herself, lived there. She presented herself as a woman of breeding who had fallen on difficult times. The details of her misfortune varied depending on the audience. Dr. Chadwick was a widower. He was comfortable but not wealthy. He practiced medicine in Cleveland and enjoyed the social life of the city's upper middle class. He was the kind of man who attended the right dinners, belonged to the right clubs, and never once questioned whether the world he inhabited might contain predators more sophisticated than himself. When Cassie fainted in his presence at the boarding house, he caught her. When she woke, she was grateful, charming, and entirely focused on him. The courtship was swift. The wedding took place in Windsor, Ontario, just across the border. It was quiet, almost furtive. Cassie had reasons to avoid a public ceremony in Cleveland, though Dr. Chadwick did not know what they were. What he knew was that he had married a woman of grace and mystery. What he did not know was that he had married a convicted forger who had served time in the Ohio State Penitentiary. He did not know about Elizabeth Bigley. He did not know about Madame LaRose or Lydia DeVere or the 7-day marriage to Dr. Springsteen. He did not know about the son, Emil, hidden somewhere in the margins of her former lives. He knew nothing. And nothing is what he had married. But the marriage gave Cassie something invaluable. It gave her an address. Specifically, it gave her 8206 Euclid Avenue in Cleveland, Ohio. To understand what that address meant in the late 1890s, you must understand what Euclid Avenue was. The Baedeker Travel Guide, the same guide that told European tourists where to find the best restaurants in Paris and the finest views in Rome, described Euclid Avenue as the showplace of America. It was the most celebrated residential street in the country. Perhaps in the world. The avenue stretched east from Public Square in downtown Cleveland, lined with American elm trees whose canopies met overhead to form a green cathedral. The mansions that stood along it were monuments to the industrial fortunes that had built them. John D. Rockefeller lived there. So did Senator Marcus Hanna, the political kingmaker, the Mather family, whose iron ore fed the steel mills, the Wades, the Brushes, the Chisholms. Each house was grander than the last. Medina sandstone facades, iron gates, carriage houses larger than the homes of the families who served them. This was Millionaire's Row, and Cassie Chadwick now lived on it. The house at 8206 was not the grandest on the avenue. Dr. Chadwick's fortune did not put him in the same orbit as a Rockefeller or a Hanna, but it did not matter. The address was the credential. Living on Euclid Avenue meant you belonged. It meant you had been accepted by the machinery of Cleveland's elite. It meant that when you walked into a bank, the tellers straightened their ties. Cassie understood this immediately. She understood it better than her husband, who had lived on the avenue for years without ever fully grasping its power. She saw what the address could do if wielded correctly. It was not just a home. It was a weapon. she began to spend. Lavishly, conspicuously, she redecorated the house. She hosted parties. She ordered gowns from the best dressmakers in New York. She acquired jewelry with the systematic intensity of a general acquiring territory. Dr. Chadwick noticed the spending, but did not understand its source. When he asked, Cassie mentioned vague family trusts and distant inheritances. He accepted these explanations the way he accepted everything, without friction. Meanwhile, across the street and down the block, the great families of Cleveland went about their lives. They noticed the new Mrs. Chadwick. Some found her charming, others found her excessive. A few found her suspicious. But suspicion on Euclid Avenue was expressed in whispers, not accusations. To accuse a neighbor was to risk a scene, and scenes were the one thing the residents of Millionaires' Row could not abide. A convicted forger was now living among the richest families in America. She slept in their world, she dined in their restaurants, she attended their churches. And nobody knew, not the Rockefellers, not the Hannahs, not the bankers who would soon hand her millions of dollars based on nothing more than a name she had stolen and a signature she had forged. The stage was set, the audience was seated, and Cassie Chadwick was about to deliver the performance of her life. Hashtag Chapter 4, the carriage ride that built AN Empire. Sometime around 1900, Cassie Chadwick arranged for a prominent Cleveland attorney to witness something he was never supposed to see, and it was the most calculated performance of her life. The attorney's name was Dillon. He was well-connected, well-respected, and exactly the kind of man whose word carried weight in the drawing rooms and banking offices of Cleveland's elite. Cassie invited him to accompany her on a trip to New York. She said she had business there. She was vague about the details. Dillon agreed, likely flattered by the attention of a woman he believed to be wealthy and well-connected. In New York, Cassie directed the carriage to Fifth Avenue, specifically to the mansion of Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie's home was one of the most recognizable private residences in America. It sat at 981st Street, like a fortress of the new industrial order. Everyone knew what it was. Everyone knew who lived there. The building itself was a statement of power so overwhelming that it needed no explanation. Cassie asked Dillon to wait in the carriage. She walked to the front door. She rang the bell. A servant answered. She spoke briefly, then entered. She was inside for approximately 30 minutes. What happened during those 30 minutes is one of the great unanswered questions of the story. Cassie later claimed she had met with Carnegie himself. Carnegie later denied ever meeting her. The most likely explanation is the simplest one. She spoke to a housekeeper. She may have posed as a dressmaker, a charity solicitor, or simply a woman making a social call. The staff of a man like Carnegie dealt with dozens of visitors daily. A well-dressed woman asking to leave a card would not have been remarkable. But Dillon did not know any of this. He saw only what Cassie wanted him to see. A woman he trusted entering the private residence of the richest man in America and emerging 30 minutes later with tears in her eyes. She returned to the carriage clutching a piece of paper. She was visibly emotional. She accidentally dropped the paper where Dillon could see it. It appeared to be a promissory note signed by Andrew Carnegie. The amount on the note was staggering. Dillon saw the note. He said nothing. He was not supposed to have seen it. Cassie, with perfect timing, gathered the paper and composed herself. She asked him, quietly, to say nothing about what he had witnessed. The implication was unmistakable. She was Andrew Carnegie's illegitimate daughter. The note was evidence of his secret financial support. The visit to his mansion had been a private family matter. Dillon kept his silence. But silence, as Cassie knew, is never truly silent. Within weeks, the rumor had spread through Cleveland's banking circles. Cassie Chadwick was Carnegie's secret daughter. Carnegie was supporting her with enormous sums. She had promissory notes worth millions. The next step was the vault. Cassie took the forged securities to the Wade Park Banking Company in Cleveland. She asked the bank's treasurer, a man named Reynolds, to place a sealed package in the vault for safekeeping. Reynolds agreed. He did not open the package. He did not examine the documents. He simply wrote a receipt. That receipt was the cornerstone. Think about what she had built. She had a lawyer who believed he had witnessed a private meeting with Carnegie. She had a sealed package in a reputable bank vault that she claimed contained Carnegie's promissory notes. She had a receipt from the bank proving the package existed, and she had the address on Euclid Avenue proving she moved among the wealthy. No single piece of evidence was conclusive, but together they formed a structure that looked, from the outside, exactly like legitimacy. It was architecture, it was engineering, and it was entirely hollow. The forged documents claimed two things. First, that Carnegie owed Cassie $7 million in promissory obligations, payable on demand. Second, that upon Carnegie's death, she would inherit an additional sum that some estimates placed at $400 million. To understand the audacity of these numbers, you must understand the scale of Carnegie's fortune. By 1900, Carnegie Steel was producing more steel than the entire nation of Great Britain. The company's annual profits regularly exceeded $40 million. In 1901, Carnegie would sell his steel interests to J.P. Morgan for $480 million, a figure so vast that it represented roughly 2.5% of the entire American economy. Carnegie was not merely rich. He was a force of nature measured in percentages of the national output, and Cassie Chadwick had forged his name on a promissory note. The package sat in the vault at Wade Park Bank like a seed in dark soil. Cassie did not rush to use it. She let it sit. She let its existence become known through the same informal channels that had spread the rumor about Carnegie. A sealed package of securities deposited by Mrs. Chadwick, held under lock and key by one of Cleveland's most respectable banking institutions. The receipt was real. The vault was real. The bank was real. Only the contents were false. But a sealed package, by its nature, demands trust. Opening it would have been an insult, and in the Gilded Age, insults were more expensive than loans. She began to borrow. The banks came to her. Word had spread through the informal networks that connected Cleveland's financial world. Here was a woman sitting on a fortune, waiting for Carnegie's obligations to come due. A loan to Cassie Chadwick was not charity, it was an investment. The interest rates she agreed to pay were extraordinary, 25%, compounding annually. The bankers did not see these rates as a warning sign, they saw them as a windfall. One by one, they lined up. They did not verify. They could not verify. And the reason they could not verify was the most elegant element of the entire fraud. In the Gilded Age, a man like Andrew Carnegie could not be asked about an illegitimate daughter. The social code forbade it. Illegitimacy was a scandal so toxic that even raising the question would constitute an offense against the man's honor. No banker, no lawyer, no gentleman of standing would dare approach Carnegie and ask whether he had fathered a child out of wedlock. To ask the question was to imply the answer, and to imply the answer was to end your relationship with the most powerful industrialist in America. Cassie did not just exploit this code, she weaponized it. She turned the silence of respectable men into the foundation of a financial empire. The bankers believed they were exploiting Carnegie's family shame. They thought they were the clever ones, collecting enormous interest on loans backed by a billionaire's guilty secret. They were not the clever ones. They were the marks, and the woman who had failed to fool the shopkeepers of Eastwood, Ontario, was now fooling the banking establishment of the richest nation on earth. Chapter 5. The bankers who thought they were the predators. The men who loaned Cassie Chadwick millions of dollars did not think they were being generous. They thought they were getting rich off a powerful man's shame. This distinction matters. It is the hinge on which the entire story turns. The conventional telling of the Cassie Chadwick affair frames it as a tale of a brilliant con artist and her hapless victims. But the men who lent her money were not hapless. They were greedy. They were calculating. And they believed, to a man, that they were the ones running the game. Consider the arithmetic. When Charles Beckwith, president of the Citizens National Bank of Oberlin, Ohio, loaned Cassie Chadwick $240,000, he was lending 4 times his bank's total capital stock of $60,000. He was not doing this out of kindness. He was doing it because the interest rate was 25%, compounding annually. If the loan was repaid on schedule, Beckwith would earn more in interest than his bank's entire capital base. He was making a bet. The bet was that Carnegie's daughter would pay, and that Carnegie's estate would pay even more upon the old man's death. Beckwith was 65 years old. He had run the Citizens National Bank for decades. He was a pillar of Oberlin, a community built around its famous college. He was, by every measure, a conservative man in a conservative town making the most reckless financial decision of his life, and he believed he was being shrewd. The chain of trust that led the money to Cassie was not a straight line. It was a web, and the spider at its center had spun each thread with care. Consider how the connection to Beckwith was built. In Cleveland, Cassie cultivated a relationship with Reverend Charles Eaton. Eaton was the pastor of Euclid Avenue Baptist Church, which was John D. Rockefeller's church. Eaton's association with Rockefeller gave him a credibility that extended far beyond his pulpit. When Eaton spoke, people listened. And Eaton spoke well of Cassie Chadwick. Eaton had a brother in Boston named Herbert. Herbert Eaton knew a banker named Herbert Newton. Newton ran a banking operation in Brookline, Massachusetts, and was always looking for lucrative investments. When Herbert Eaton mentioned that a woman of extraordinary wealth in Cleveland needed short-term financing, Newton's ears perked up. When he learned that the woman's wealth derived from Andrew Carnegie himself, his caution evaporated. Newton began lending. The sums were enormous, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And Newton, like Beckwith, charged interest rates that would be considered predatory by any standard. He did not feel guilty about this. He felt clever. He was extracting wealth from a family scandal involving the richest man in the country, and nobody could stop him. This is the reframing the story demands. These men were not innocent. They were participants in what they believed to be a form of legalized extortion. They were lending money at usurious rates to a woman they believed could not refuse their terms because her financial situation derived from an illegitimate relationship that could not be made public. They were exploiting shame, or so they thought. Cassie was not the only woman of the era who had discovered this vulnerability in the system. Consider the case of Anne Odelia Dis-Debar, who in the 1880s posed as a spirit medium and convinced a wealthy New York lawyer named Luther Marsh that spirits were producing paintings in his home. Marsh gave her his house. Or consider Ellen Peck, who spent decades defrauding banks and wealthy men through a combination of charm, forged documents, and the exploitation of social propriety. These women were not anomalies. They were symptoms. The Gilded Age had constructed a financial system built on personal reputation, social connections, and gentlemen's agreements. There was no centralized credit reporting. There were no standardized verification procedures. There was no telephone call a banker could make to confirm a borrower's claims. A banker's judgment about a borrower's creditworthiness was based on the same factors that determined a dinner invitation. Who do you know? Where do you live? What is your name? What church do you attend? These questions had nothing to do with financial soundness. They had everything to do with social belonging. Cassie Chadwick understood this. She understood that the system was not designed to catch fraud. It was designed to facilitate trust among people who already belonged to the same social class. If you could get inside the circle would protect you. If you could attach your name to the right names, no one would question the attachment. The amounts she borrowed are difficult to comprehend in their original terms. Adjusted for inflation, her total borrowings approached $72 million. She borrowed from banks in Cleveland, Oberlin, Boston, New York, and elsewhere. Each lender believed he was the only one. Each believed his loan was uniquely secured by Carnegie's fortune. None of them talked to each other. The same social code that prevented them from asking Carnegie about his daughter also prevented them from discussing their loans with competing bankers. To reveal the arrangement was to reveal the shame, and shame was bad for business. Were these men victims? Yes, Cassie Chadwick committed fraud on a massive scale, and the men who lent her money lost everything. But they were not the kind of victims who deserve uncomplicated sympathy. They were men who saw an opportunity to profit from a powerful man's scandal, who charged rates that should have been illegal, and who abandoned every principle of sound banking because greed told them the risk was worth it. The tragedy of Charles Beckwith is not that he was fooled. It is that he allowed himself to be fooled because the reward for believing the lie was so much greater than the reward for questioning it. And the lie, at this point, was still growing. Hashtag Chapter 6. 56 rings ANDA golden bird that sang. At the height of her power, Cassie Chadwick spent $100,000 on a single dinner party, and the bankers who paid for it only lent her more. The years between 1900 and 1904 were the apex. The summit, the moment when the performance achieved a velocity that seemed, to everyone watching, indistinguishable from reality. Cassie Chadwick was not pretending to be rich anymore. She was rich. The money was borrowed, every cent of it, but borrowed money spends the same as earned money. And in the Gilded Age, no one asked where it came from. Her Landau carriage rolled down Euclid Avenue in the afternoons, and crowds gathered on the sidewalks to watch. The carriage itself was a work of art. The horses were immaculate. The driver was liveried. Cassie sat inside, wearing gowns that cost more than most Cleveland families earned in a year. She nodded to the crowds. She waved. She performed royalty, and the city received the performance as though it were fact. The spending was not merely extravagant. It was compulsive. It was operatic. It was spending designed to be seen, cataloged, and reported. And the details, when they later emerged in court documents and newspaper accounts, read like the inventory of a fever dream. From a single jeweler, she purchased 56 rings. One diamond required 12,400 miles of travel across Europe to locate and procure. She had 8 drawers overflowing with pearls. 30 closets held her clothing. Her silver service contained 900 pieces. She owned china cups with rubies set into the porcelain. At Christmas, she gifted 8 grand pianos to various associates and acquaintances, as casually as another woman might give boxes of chocolate. And then there was the golden bird. In a golden cage, on a golden perch, sat a mechanical bird made entirely of gold. When one pressed a golden lever, the bird opened its golden beak and sang. The sound was delicate and precise, a tiny manufactured melody emerging from a creature that was, like everything else in Cassie Chadwick's world, beautiful and hollow and built to perform. The bird is the metaphor the story has been waiting for. A golden creature in a golden cage, singing on command, dazzling everyone who heard it, and utterly, completely artificial. One Christmas Eve, Cassie decided that the interior of her mansion was insufficient. She hired workers to redecorate the entire house overnight. When the guests arrived on Christmas morning, they found a completely transformed residence. New furnishings, new draperies, new everything. The cost was astronomical, the effect was theatrical, and the message was clear. Cassie Chadwick could remake the world while you slept. The dinner parties were legendary. A single event could cost $100,000, a sum equivalent to roughly $3 million in today's currency. The food was imported. The wine was the best available. The guest lists were curated to include the people Cassie needed to see her and be seen with. Each party was an investment in the illusion. Each lavish meal was another layer of armor around the lie. Cleveland's 400, the self-appointed arbiters of social acceptability, watched all of this with a mixture of fascination and unease. Some of them sensed that something was wrong. The spending was too aggressive. The wealth appeared too suddenly. A woman who had arrived in Cleveland as a boarder in a modest house was now outspending families whose fortunes stretched back generations. But what could they say? What evidence did they have? She lived on Euclid Avenue. Her husband was a doctor. The banks lent her money. The jewelers filled her orders. Every institution that was supposed to validate wealth had validated hers. To question Cassie Chadwick was to question the system itself, and the system was working beautifully for everyone involved. The servants talked, of course. They always do. The maids whispered about the spending. The drivers compared notes. The tradesmen who delivered the silver and the china and the furs exchanged looks that their employers never noticed. The working people who maintained Millionaires' Row could see what the residents could not, because the working people had no stake in the illusion. But servants' gossip was not evidence, and in the Gilded Age, the observations of the poor carried no weight in the world of the rich, except that it was not working, it was dying. Beneath the golden surface, the structure was pure Ponzi. Cassie was borrowing from new lenders to pay old ones. Each new loan was larger than the last, because each new loan had to cover both the previous debt and the interest that had accumulated on it. The mathematics were merciless. At 25% annual interest, a $100,000 loan became $125,000 after a year. $156,000 after 2, nearly $200,000 after 3. The debts were doubling faster than the loans could cover them. This is the nature of every Ponzi scheme. It requires infinite growth to sustain finite lies. And there is no such thing as infinite growth. There is only the moment when the music stops and everyone realizes there are not enough chairs. By 1904, Cassie Chadwick owed millions. The precise total would never be fully established because she kept no books, maintained no records, and dealt with each lender separately. But the estimates range from 1 million to 20 million in the currency of the day. Adjusted for inflation, the upper estimates approach $72 million. All of it was borrowed. All of it was spent. And all of it was secured by a forged signature on a piece of paper locked in a vault that Irie Reynolds had never opened. The entire edifice depended on one thing. One fragile, absurd, magnificent thing. Nobody could call Andrew Carnegie and ask him if Cassie Chadwick was his daughter. And then, someone did. Chapter 7. The Boston banker who demanded his money back. In November of 1904, Herbert Newton made the mistake of asking for repayment, and one question collapsed 7 years of lies. Newton had been patient. He had been confident. He had watched his loans to Cassie Chadwick accumulate interest at rates that would have made a loan shark blush, and he had counted his future profits with the certainty of a man who believed he held all the cards. But patience has a limit, and in the autumn of 1904, Newton reached his. The trigger was information. Newton had begun to hear rumors, not about Cassie's identity, not about the forgery, but about other loans. He was learning, for the first time, that he was not the only banker lending to Cassie Chadwick. The loans were larger than he had imagined. The debts were wider than he had known. And the question that had never occurred to him before now arrived with the force of a train. If Carnegie's daughter had access to Carnegie's fortune, why was she borrowing from so many people? Newton did not panic. He was a businessman. He sent a letter. The letter demanded repayment. It was firm but polite. It assumed compliance. Bankers in the Gilded Age did not threaten. They requested. The threat was implied. Cassie could not pay. This was the fundamental problem. She had never been able to pay. She had only ever been able to borrow. and borrowing to pay Newton meant borrowing from someone else, and there was no one else. The system had expanded to its limits. Every banker she could reach had already lent. Every dollar she could access was already owed. She stalled. She made excuses. She promised payments that did not arrive. Newton waited. Then Newton stopped waiting. He filed a lawsuit. The lawsuit was not quiet. Lawsuits in the Gilded Age were public affairs, recorded in court documents and reported in newspapers. The filing cracked the dam. Other creditors saw the suit. They began asking their own questions. The inquiries spread through the banking community with the speed of a fire in dry timber. And then someone did the one thing that 7 years of fraud had depended on no one doing. Someone asked Andrew Carnegie. The question reached Carnegie through channels that the records do not fully document. What is documented is his response. It was issued through his secretary, and it was devastating in its brevity. Mr. Carnegie does not know Mrs. Chadwick of Cleveland. Mr. Carnegie has not signed a note for more than 30 years. Read that again. 12 words and 2 sentences. And every dollar of Cassie Chadwick's borrowed fortune evaporated between the first period and the last. Carnegie did not know her. He had never met her. He had never signed a note for her. He had never supported her. The promissory notes were forgeries. The sealed package in Irie Reynolds' vault was worthless. The fortune was fiction. The inheritance was imagination. And every loan, every interest payment, every calculation of future profit that every banker had made was based on nothing. The chain reaction was instantaneous. Word spread from banker to banker, from creditor to creditor, from newsroom to newsroom. Each man who had lent money to Cassie Chadwick suddenly understood that he was not holding a secured loan. He was holding a worthless piece of paper signed by a woman who had no money, no inheritance, and no connection to the richest man in America. The panic was not dignified. These were men who had prided themselves on their composure, their judgment, their ability to assess risk. They had built careers on the appearance of calm deliberation. And now, they were scrambling to their vaults, pulling out loan documents, rereading the terms of agreements that suddenly looked very different than they had a week ago. The notes they had accepted as collateral were forgeries. The interest they had calculated was fantasy. The fortunes they had counted were smoke. They all realized it at the same time, and they all reached the same conclusion at the same time. They were ruined. The newspapers, once content to report on Cassie's glamorous lifestyle, now turned with the savage efficiency of an industry that profits from both the rise and the fall. Headlines screamed across front pages from Cleveland to New York to Boston. The woman who had been admired was now exposed. The bankers who had been envied were now pitied. The entire structure, built on silence and shame and the unwillingness of powerful men to ask simple questions, came apart in days. What is remarkable is how fast it happened. 7 years of construction, days of demolition. This is always the math of fraud. Building the lie is slow, careful, painstaking work. Destroying it requires only one question. Newton got his question answered, but the answer did not save him. Nothing could save any of them now. The money was gone. It had been spent on 56 rings and 900 pieces of silver and a golden bird that sang when you pressed a golden lever. The ruins were about to be measured, and the measurement would start in Oberlin. #Chapter 8, God, then all is lost. The run on the Citizens National Bank of Oberlin began before the doors opened, and by the time they closed, they would never open again. Oberlin was not Cleveland. It was not New York. It was not Boston. It was a small college town in northern Ohio, proud of its progressive history and its famous institution, Oberlin College. The college had been the first in America to regularly admit black students and one of the first to admit women. The town's identity was built on principle, its economy was built on the bank. Charles Beckwith had run the Citizens National Bank for decades. He was 65 years old. He was a grandfather. He went to church. He served on committees. He was, in the language of the era, a solid man. The kind of man you trusted with your money, because the alternative was to question the entire structure of small-town American life. Beckwith had lent Cassie Chadwick $240,000. The bank's total capital stock was $60,000. He had lent 4 times the capital. He had also lent $102,000 of his own personal savings. Every dollar he had earned over a lifetime of careful, conservative banking was now secured by a forged signature. When the news broke, the depositors came. They came before dawn. They stood in lines that wrapped around the building. They were farmers and shopkeepers and professors and students. They were the people of Oberlin, and they wanted their money. There was no money. Beckwith stood in his office and received the reports. The vault was empty. The reserves were gone. The loans to Chadwick had consumed everything. He called a meeting of the board. He told them the truth. The room, according to one account, was silent. The old man's face told the story before his words did. Tears ran down his cheeks. He could not speak clearly. The reputation he had built over 4 decades was dissolving in real time, and he could feel it going, like heat leaving a body. When a reporter found him and asked for comment, Beckwith said a single word: no. That word. That small, complete, final syllable. It is the sound of a man who has been reduced to his smallest possible expression. He had no defense. He had no explanation. He had no hope that anything he could say would matter. He said no, and the word meant everything and nothing at the same time. The bank failed. The doors closed. The depositors lost their savings. Oberlin College students who had entrusted their money to the Citizens National Bank found themselves penniless. Faculty members who had saved for years discovered that their retirement had been lent to a woman in Cleveland who spent it on dinner parties. The losses were not abstract. They were measured in meals not eaten, rents not paid, educations interrupted, retirements destroyed. $240,000 in bank loans, $102,000 of Beckwith's personal funds, deposits from hundreds of families. All gone. In today's money, the damage exceeded $7 million. For a town the size of Oberlin, it was an extinction event. The ripple effects moved outward. Local businesses that depended on the college's spending saw their revenues collapse. Landlords whose tenants had lost their savings could not collect rent. The merchants on Main Street who had extended credit to families they had known for decades now faced the choice between enforcing debts against their neighbors and absorbing the losses themselves. A small-town economy is a web of mutual dependence. Cut one strand, and the whole structure trembles. Beckwith's loans to Cassie Chadwick had not just destroyed a bank. They had severed the economic lifeline of an entire community. Beckwith took to his bed. He did not recover. The man who had walked to work every morning for decades, who had greeted depositors by name, who had believed himself a careful steward of other people's trust, now lay in his house and waited to die. He called Cassie Chadwick the most deep-dyed fraud in the world. Then, he stopped talking. He was not the only man destroyed. Dr. Leroy Chadwick, Cassie's husband, fled to Europe when the scandal broke. He returned eventually, humiliated, and found that his comfortable life on Euclid Avenue had evaporated. The house that had been the platform for his wife's fraud was now a monument to his humiliation. He would later be reduced to playing Cassie's pipe organ at a local venue for $100 a week. Erie Reynolds, the treasurer at Wade Park Bank, who had sealed Cassie's forged documents in the vault without examining them, was disgraced. His career was over. His reputation was destroyed. He had done nothing wrong by the standards of his profession. He had simply followed the conventions of trust that governed banking in the Gilded Age, and those conventions had been weaponized against him. Reverend Charles Eaton, whose association with Rockefeller's church had lent credibility to the chain of trust that connected Cassie to her lenders, found his own reputation shattered. He had been a link in the chain. He had vouched for Cassie, however indirectly, and the link had broken. This is what Cassie Chadwick's fraud looked like from the ground. Not numbers on a ledger, not headlines in a newspaper, but an old man weeping in his office, a bank that would never open again, students without savings, a husband playing a pipe organ for tips, a reverend questioning whether his faith in human nature had been the instrument of his undoing. The woman who had done all this was not in Oberlin. She was not in Cleveland. She was in New York, and she was wearing a money belt. Hashtag Chapter 9, the Duchess of Diamonds in a money belt. On December 7th, 1904, police found Cassie Chadwick in a hotel bed, wearing a belt containing more cash than most Americans would earn in 10 lifetimes. The Hotel Breslin sat at the corner of Broadway and 29th Street in Manhattan. It was the kind of establishment that catered to the wealthy and the desperate, and by December of 1904, Cassie Chadwick was both. She had checked in under a false name. She had paid in cash. She had drawn the curtains and taken to her bed. When the detectives arrived, they found a woman who appeared to be in the grip of a nervous collapse. She was pale. She was agitated. She complained of chest pains and shortness of breath. She asked for a doctor. She may have been genuinely ill. She may have been performing. With Cassie Chadwick, the line between the two had always been difficult to locate. The money belt contained $100,000 in cash, in 1904 dollars, adjusted for inflation, approximately $3 million in today's money. She wore it against her body, under her clothes, in bed. It was the con artist's final costume. Everything else had been taken or would be taken. The mansion, the carriage, the 56 rings, the 900 pieces of silver, the golden bird in its golden cage. But the money belt was hers. She had strapped the last of the illusion to her skin. She was arrested on federal charges and transported back to Cleveland for trial. The newspapers followed every step. This was the biggest fraud case in American memory, and the press covered it with a mixture of outrage and fascination that reflected the public's own divided feelings. Cassie Chadwick was a criminal. She was also, undeniably, spectacular. The trial began in March of 1905. Cassie appeared in the courtroom wearing black silk, her hair arranged with carved ebony combs. She looked, according to one reporter, like a woman attending a funeral. Perhaps she was. The prosecution was led by United States Attorney John Sullivan, and Sullivan was not inclined toward mercy. He called Cassie Chadwick the most dangerous criminal known to human society today. The phrase was theatrical, but it was not entirely wrong. Cassie had not killed anyone directly. But Charles Beckwith was dead. The Citizens National Bank was closed. Families across Ohio and Massachusetts were ruined. The damage was measured not in bodies, but in broken lives, and the count was still rising. The courtroom was packed every day of the trial. Reporters from New York, Boston, Chicago, and Philadelphia filled the gallery. The public could not get enough. Here was a woman who had convinced America's most careful bankers that she was the secret daughter of its richest citizen. The audacity alone was worth the price of admission. The details that emerged during testimony were even better. The witnesses described the dinner parties, the jewelry, the carriage rides. They described loans made in private offices, handshakes that sealed agreements, and the quiet understanding that the money was backed by Carnegie's fortune. Each witness told the same story from a different angle, and each angle revealed another facet of the same colossal lie. The evidence was overwhelming. The forged promissory notes, the testimony of the bankers. The sealed package at Wade Park Bank finally opened, revealing worthless paper, the trail of loans, interest payments, and defaulted debts that wound through half a dozen states. Cassie's defense was thin. She did not deny borrowing the money. She denied that she had deceived anyone. She claimed, implausibly, that the bankers had known the risks and lent willingly. Andrew Carnegie appeared. Or rather, Andrew Carnegie made an appearance. The distinction matters. He entered the courtroom, and the room went silent. He was 70 years old. His white beard and small stature gave him the appearance of a stern, benevolent grandfather. He looked at Cassie Chadwick. One reporter described it as a single sweeping glance. He did not speak to her. He did not address her. He simply looked. Then he testified. He did not know this woman. He had never signed notes for her. He had never agreed to support her. He had no illegitimate children, and if he did, this was not one of them. His tone, according to reports, was more bemused than angry. Carnegie found the whole affair mildly interesting. He had been the victim of a fraud, technically, but the fraud had not cost him a penny. His name had been stolen, but his name was strong enough to survive the theft. He was the richest man in the world. He could afford to be amused. The jury was not amused. They deliberated and returned a verdict. Guilty on 7 counts of conspiracy to commit fraud. The sentence was 14 years in the Ohio State Penitentiary. Cassie collapsed. She screamed. She wept. She clutched the rail and had to be removed from the courtroom. The performance continued to the last moment, and perhaps beyond. With Cassie Chadwick, one could never be entirely certain where the performance ended and the person began. Beckwith was not there. He was dead. He had died on March 1st, 1905, barely 3 months after the scandal broke. He was 65. He had called her the most deep-dyed fraud in the world. He had whispered God, "Then all is lost." And then he had stopped eating, stopped sleeping, and stopped living. The verdict closed one chapter, but the cost of the fraud could not be measured by a sentence. 14 years for $72 million in stolen wealth. 14 years for a dead banker, a ruined town, and a system of trust that had been exposed as hollow. The law called it justice. The math called it something else. # Chapter 10. The richest man pays and the broken man dies. Andrew Carnegie found the whole affair mildly amusing, and that may be the cruelest detail in this entire story. While Beckwith died and the people of Oberlin counted their losses, Carnegie was writing checks, not because he felt responsible, not because anyone had successfully argued that his name, which Cassie had stolen, carried an obligation to the people she had defrauded. He wrote checks because Andrew Carnegie was, by 1905, the most prolific philanthropist in American history. And Oberlin was exactly the kind of community he liked to help. He donated to Oberlin College. He funded a library endowment. The Carnegie Building, a handsome structure on the Oberlin campus, was completed in 1907. It stands today. It is made of stone and will outlast every person mentioned in this story. Carnegie reportedly quipped that Cassie had proven his credit was a number 1. The joke landed well in the drawing rooms of New York. It landed less well in Oberlin, where families were still discovering the full scope of their losses. This is the divide the story ultimately exposes. For Carnegie, the fraud was a dinner party anecdote, a curious episode involving a bold woman and some foolish bankers. He had lost nothing. His fortune was untouched. His reputation, if anything, was enhanced. After all, Cassie had chosen his name precisely because it was the most powerful name in America. The fraud was, in a perverse way, a compliment. For Beckwith, the fraud was death, not metaphorical death, actual death. The man stopped living because his world collapsed and he could not reassemble it. He lost his bank, his savings, his reputation, and his will to continue. He was 65 years old, and the last months of his life were spent in a bed, weeping, refusing food, waiting for the end that he had no reason to delay. The contrast is the point. In the Gilded Age, as in every age, the truly wealthy were insulated from consequence. Carnegie could absorb the theft of his name the way a mountain absorbs rain. Beckwith could not absorb the loss of his savings the way a man cannot absorb a bullet. The same event, the same fraud, the same woman, produced two entirely different outcomes. One man laughed, the other man died. Dr. Leroy Chadwick returned from Europe and found that his life on Euclid Avenue was over. The house at 8206. Once the platform for his wife's social performances was now a scandal site. The neighbors who had once nodded politely now looked away. Dr. Chadwick, who had never understood what his wife was doing and never asked, was reduced to working as a musician. He played Cassie's pipe organ at a local establishment for $100 a week. The instrument that had once filled a mansion with music now filled a rented room. Erie Reynolds, the man who had sealed the forged documents in the Wade Park vault, spent the rest of his life under a cloud. He had followed procedure, he had done what bankers did, but the procedure itself had been the vulnerability, and Reynolds was the man who stood at the point of failure. The Gilded Age had no mechanism for this kind of accounting, no insurance, no federal deposit protection, no safety net for the depositors of a failed bank in a small Ohio town. The losses were permanent. The people of Oberlin absorbed them and moved on, because there was nothing else to do. Carnegie went on building libraries. He gave away $350 million before he died. His name is on concert halls, universities, and institutions across the world. He is remembered as one of history's great philanthropists. Beckwith is remembered by almost no one. He is a footnote. A cautionary figure in a story that most people have never heard. The richest man paid and was praised. The broken man died and was forgotten. The architecture of that outcome has not changed. Hashtag Chapter 11, she died on her birthday, A&D told no one the truth. Cassie Chadwick brought trunks of finery to prison, as if she expected the performance to continue even behind bars. The Ohio State Penitentiary received her in the spring of 1905. She arrived with luggage that suggested a woman checking into a resort rather than a federal facility. Animal skin rugs, fine clothing, personal effects of the sort that no prisoner had any business possessing. The warden, by most accounts, was unsure what to do with her. Cassie Chadwick was not a typical inmate. Then again, she had never been a typical anything. Prison did not quiet her. In the early months, she issued statements through her lawyers that were less confessions than counterattacks. She threatened to expose the businessmen who had lent her money at rates that exceeded legal limits. If they wanted to call her a fraud, she would call them usurers. If they wanted to paint themselves as victims, she would paint them as predators. She knew their names, she knew the rates, she knew the details of every transaction, and she was not above using that knowledge as leverage. It was a bluff. Probably, but it was a bluff that carried enough truth to make powerful men uncomfortable. The interest rates the bankers had charged were, in many cases, illegal. They had lent money at 25% because they believed the borrower was backed by Carnegie's fortune and could not refuse their terms. They had been willing to exploit a woman they believed to be trapped by scandal. Cassie's threat reminded them that exploitation is a sword with two edges. Nothing came of the threats. The bankers did not pay her. The courts did not revisit the interest rates. Cassie Chadwick was a convicted felon, and convicted felons do not get to renegotiate the terms of their disgrace. Her health deteriorated. The nervous collapse that had been partly performance at the Hotel Breslin became, in prison, partly real. She suffered from a variety of ailments that the prison doctors struggled to diagnose. Some were physical, some were psychological. The line between the two, as always with Cassie, was impossible to draw. The woman who had commanded rooms full of wealthy men now commanded nothing. The walls did not respond to charm, the guards did not extend credit. For the first time since she was 13 years old, Elizabeth Bigley was living in a world that did not bend to performance. She never confessed. Not once. Not to the full scope of the fraud, not to the identities she had worn and discarded, not to the total amount she had stolen. She maintained, to the end, a version of events in which she was misunderstood rather than criminal, unlucky rather than dishonest, betrayed by the system rather than a betrayer of it. The precise amount she stole died with her. The court documents catalog millions, but the records are incomplete. She kept no books. She maintained no accounts. She dealt in cash, in promissory notes, in verbal agreements that evaporated when the trust that sustained them dissolved. Investigators estimated the total somewhere between $1 and $20 million in the currency of the day. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, and it will never be known. On October 10th, 1907, Cassie Chadwick died. She was 50 years old. It was her birthday. She had served less than 3 years of her 14-year sentence. The cause of death was not definitively established. Some accounts cite a nervous breakdown that led to physical collapse. Others suggest underlying conditions that prison accelerated. She was buried in an unmarked grave. The woman who had worn 56 rings and owned a golden bird and redecorated a mansion overnight was put in the ground with no stone to mark the spot. Her son Emile disappeared from the historical record. He had grown up in the gaps between his mother's identities, raised under names that were not his, in places that were not home. After her death, he vanished. Whether he changed his name again, whether he moved far away, whether he built a life free from the shadow of her fraud, no one knows. The boy who was born in obscurity returned to it. Cassie Chadwick left behind no memoir, no journal, no account of how she had done what she did or why. She left behind 56 rings, a ruined bank, a dead man, a pipe organ, and a question that she refused to answer. The performance ended the way all performances end. The lights went down, the audience went home, and the stage was empty. Hashtag chapter 12, the door that society propped open. We want to believe we would not have been fooled, and that certainty is the exact vulnerability Cassie Chadwick exploited. Stand for a moment on Euclid Avenue in Cleveland today. The mansions are gone. Most of them were demolished in the first half of the 20th century, replaced by commercial buildings, churches, and parking lots. The address 8206 Euclid Avenue, where Cassie Chadwick held court and spent fortunes that did not exist, is now a church parking lot. The elm trees that once formed a canopy over the avenue are gone, killed by disease decades ago. Millionaires Row is a memory that the city has mostly chosen to forget. But at Oberlin College, the Carnegie building still stands. Andrew Carnegie's money built it. Charles Beckwith's money, in a sense, paid for the crisis that prompted the gift. The building is made of stone. It does not explain itself. It simply endures. And somewhere, in the historical archives and the newspaper morgues and the courthouse records that survive from 1905, the details of Cassie Chadwick's fraud remain, available to anyone who looks, known to almost no one who does not. HBO created a character inspired by her. Writers and historians have revisited her story periodically, but she has never achieved the fame of other Gilded Age figures, perhaps because her story implicates not just one woman, but the entire system she exploited. That system was built on coverture, the legal doctrine that merged a woman's identity with her husband's upon marriage. Coverture was formally dying by the time Cassie began her fraud. Married women's property acts had been passed in most states, but the culture lagged behind the law, as culture always does. In practice, a woman's financial identity in the late 19th century was still derived from the men attached to her name, her husband's name. her father's name, the name that appeared on the loan documents and the bank accounts and the property deeds. Cassie understood this. She understood that in a world where women borrowed men's identities to gain financial credibility, the most effective fraud a woman could commit was to borrow the most powerful identity available. She chose Andrew Carnegie. She attached his name to hers. And then she dared the banking system to question the attachment, knowing that the same social codes that forced women to depend on men's names also prevented anyone from asking questions about those names. The mechanism was not magic. It was not genius in the way that word is usually meant. It was observation. Cassie saw the rules of her world more clearly than the people who had written them. She saw that trust was extended not on the basis of evidence, but on the basis of appearance. She saw that verification was considered rude. She saw that men who profited from a corrupt arrangement had every incentive to maintain it and no incentive to question it. She walked through a door that society had propped open. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because the door is still open. We live in an age of credit scores and background checks and digital verification. We have systems that the Gilded Age lacked. But the fundamental mechanism that Cassie exploited has not disappeared. It has been refined. We still extend trust based on names and appearances. We still assume that wealth implies integrity. We still hesitate to question powerful people because the social cost of asking is higher than the social cost of believing. Every financial collapse of the last century has involved some version of the same architecture. Bernard Madoff ran a Ponzi scheme for decades because the people who invested with him believed that his reputation was sufficient collateral. The banks that sold subprime mortgages in 2007 did so because the names attached to the securities, the ratings agencies. The investment banks, the government-sponsored enterprises, were too prestigious to question. The venture capital firms that poured billions into companies with no revenue did so because the founders had the right names, the right schools, the right addresses. The century changes. The names change. The address changes. The mechanism remains. Cassie Chadwick was born Elizabeth Bigley on a farm in Ontario. She was partially deaf and spoke with a lisp. She had no education, no connections, and no money. She was a woman in a world that valued women only in proportion to the men who vouched for them. And she looked at that world and decided, with a clarity that bordered on contempt, to use its rules against it. She was a criminal. She destroyed lives. Charles Beckwith died because of what she did. The people of Oberlin suffered because of what she did. The bankers who trusted her lost everything because of what she did. The son she bore grew up without a true name and vanished into history without a trace. These facts are not debatable and they are not forgivable, but she did not create the vulnerability she exploited. The Gilded Age created it. The social codes that prevented verification created it. The greed that made 25% interest seem reasonable created it. The system that reduced women to appendages of male names created it. Cassie merely walked through the door. The question the story leaves us with is not whether Cassie Chadwick was brilliant or evil. She was both. The question is whether we have closed the door she walked through, or whether we have simply hung new curtains over the opening and told ourselves it is no longer there. In a world still built on names, appearances, and the assumption that powerful people cannot be questioned, who is the next Cassie Chadwick, and who is the next Charles Beckwith? The golden bird is still singing. Press the lever. Listen carefully. The song is hollow. It has always been hollow. The only question is whether we can hear it